Keanu Reeves stood quietly in the first-class cabin, his worn hoodie and sneakers a stark contrast to the polished luxury around him. Beside him, Eleanor Grayson, a woman dripping with wealth and entitlement, cast a scornful glance his way, her pride practically crackling in the air. But what happened next would silence the entire plane and turn her world upside down in ways no one saw coming. Before we dive into this gripping tale, drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from. If you're hooked on stories like this, hit that subscribe button now, because tomorrow, we've got another unforgettable journey waiting for you. Eleanor Grayson stepped onto the jet bridge at Houston's airport with the kind of confidence that didn't just open doors, it demanded they stay open. She was a real estate mogul who'd turned ambition into an empire, a woman who'd spent decades climbing to the top and had no intention of letting anyone forget it. Her tailored, pearl-colored suit hugged her frame, and her high heels clicked with authority, each step a reminder that she wasn't just another passenger, she was the passenger. Her blonde hair, perfectly waved, framed a face that rarely softened, and her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the world with the certainty that it existed to serve her. She didn't carry herself like someone who'd ever waited for anything. She moved like the line was supposed to part before she even arrived. This flight from Houston to New York was routine for her. First class, row 2, window seat. It was her domain, her reward, her right. But today, something was off. As she approached her row, she stopped short. There he was, a man already seated in 2B, right next to her spot, Keanu Reeves. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her arrival. He just sat there, slouched slightly in a brown hoodie that had seen better days, a plain gray t-shirt peeking out beneath it, and dark jeans that looked more thrift store than designer. His sneakers were scuffed, and his hands rested casually on a paperback novel, its edges worn from use. He seemed utterly at ease, like first class was just another Tuesday for him. Eleanor's brow furrowed. This wasn't right. First class was supposed to be a sanctuary for people like her, polished, powerful, pedigreed, not for someone who looked like he'd wandered in from a bus stop. She set her leather carry-on in the overhead bin with a little more force than necessary, the thunk echoing her irritation. Sliding into her seat, she adjusted her suit jacket with a sharp flick, claiming her space. She didn't say a word, not yet, but her silence was loud, a performance of disapproval meant to make him squirm. He didn't. Keanu turned a page in his book, his posture relaxed but straight, his focus unbroken. That only made it worse. Eleanor crossed her legs deliberately, her heel brushing the edge of his seat, but he didn't flinch, didn't even glance her way. She shifted again, louder this time, her purse nudging the armrest between them. Still nothing. His indifference was like a slap she couldn't return, and Eleanor Grayson didn't do invisible, not in her world, not in her seat. She'd flown this route more times than she could count, and it was always the same. Executives in crisp suits, CEOs with Rolexes ticking on their wrists, people who understood the unspoken code of first class. Presence, polish, power. This guy? He had none of it. No laptop, no briefcase, no sign he belonged, just a hoodie and a book. It unsettled her more than she'd admit. Eleanor wasn't used to sharing her space with someone who didn't at least try to match her energy. She thrived on the subtle nods of recognition, the quiet deference she commanded without asking. But this man, he didn't care. And that made her feel something she hadn't in years. Small. Who is this guy, she thought, stealing a sideways glance. His face was familiar, frustratingly so, but she couldn't place it. Not that it mattered. He didn't look like money, didn't act like influence. Maybe he'd snagged an upgrade he couldn't really afford. She huffed, loud enough to be heard, and smoothed her scarf with practiced precision. Keanu looked up briefly, offering a polite nod and the faintest hint of a smile. That was it. No explanation, no apology, just a flicker of acknowledgement before he went back to his book. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't like being dismissed, and she sure as hell didn't like being ignored. "You know," she said finally, her voice low and clipped, "first class isn't what it used to be." She let the words hang, a baited hook. Keanu blinked, then met her gaze. "Comfort's still good," he replied calmly. "People just change." His tone was even, almost too even, like he'd heard this before and didn't care enough to argue. Eleanor chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Clearly, she shot back, her eyes narrowing. He returned to his book, conversation over as far as he was concerned. But for Eleanor, it was just beginning. She leaned back, staring straight ahead, her mind already spinning. This wasn't how her flights went. She didn't share her space with strangers who didn't know their place, and if he wouldn't move, she'd make sure someone did. Because Eleanor Grayson didn't ask for respect. She took it. Keanu turned another page, unfazed, as if he could feel the storm brewing beside him, and didn't mind getting wet. She didn't know who he was, not yet, but she was about to find out that her first impression couldn't have been more wrong, and that mistake, it was going to cost her. Eleanor Grayson wasn't the type to let silence linger, not when it felt like a challenge. She'd spent years sharpening her tongue into a weapon, one she wielded with the precision of a surgeon and the venom of a viper. Keanu Reeves sat beside her, still engrossed in his paperback, his calm a brick wall she couldn't climb. It gnawed at her, that ease of his. Like he didn't even notice the throne she'd built for herself in this cabin. She shifted in her seat again, her heel tapping the floor with a rhythm that screamed impatience. "Some people," she muttered, loud enough for him to hear, "think a ticket buys them class." She smirked, waiting for a flinch, a frown, anything to prove she'd landed a hit. Keanu didn't look up. He turned a page, slow and deliberate, the rustle of paper a quiet defiance. "Guess it depends on what you're buying," he said, his voice low, steady, like a river running deep beneath the surface. Eleanor's smirk faltered. She hadn't expected a response, let alone one that didn't rise to her bait. She leaned closer, her scarf brushing the armrest, her tone sharpening. "Oh, I'm sure you're very comfortable slumming it up here with the rest of us." Her words dripped with sarcasm, each syllable a needle meant to prick his pride. He finally met her gaze, his brown eyes calm but piercing, like they could see through her mask to the insecurity she'd never admit was there. "Comfort's enough for me," he said simply. "Doesn't need a dress code." Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the way he sidestepped her jab without breaking a sweat. It wasn't humility, it was strength, and that made her blood simmer. She wasn't used to people who didn't bend under her stare, who didn't scramble to prove they belonged. She sat back, crossing her arms, her nails tapping the leather armrest. He went back to his book, and the dismissal stung more than any insult could have. She couldn't let it go. Eleanor Grayson didn't lose, not at anything, especially not at making someone feel small. She reached up and pressed the call button with a manicured finger, the chime cutting through the cabin's hum like a summons. Moments later, a young flight attendant approached. Sarah, her name tag read, her blonde ponytail bouncing slightly as she stopped at row 2. "Yes, ma'am?" Sarah asked, her voice polite but guarded, like she'd already sensed the tension. Eleanor smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, all syrup and steel. "I think there's been a mix-up," she said smoothly. "This gentleman," she gestured at Keanu without looking at him, "might be in the wrong seat. Could you check?" Her tone was casual, but the implication hung heavy. He didn't belong here, and she expected Sarah to fix it. Keanu didn't react, just kept reading. Sarah pulled out a tablet, her fingers tapping the screen as she checked the manifest. Her eyes flicked between the device and the seats. Then she straightened. "No mix-up, ma'am," she said firmly. "He's in 2B, right where he's supposed to be. You're in 2A. She nodded at Keanu, a hint of respect in her glance that Eleanor didn't miss, and didn't like. "Oh," Eleanor said, her laugh light but brittle. "Well, I just assumed." She let the sentence trail off, hoping Sarah would fill in the blanks. The flight attendant didn't. "Let me know if you need anything else," Sarah said, then walked away, leaving Eleanor with a tight jaw and a simmering resentment. She turned to Keanu, her voice dropping to a hiss. "You could have said something." He closed his book gently, resting it on his lap. "Didn't seem worth it," he replied, his calm unshaken. "You were pretty sure of yourself." Her cheeks flushed. He wasn't just brushing her off, he was calling her out, and it hit harder than she'd expected. She opened her mouth to fire back, but movement in the aisle caught her eye. A tall man in a denim jacket walked by, heading toward the restroom. His clothes were neat but worn, his posture tired, like someone who'd worked too long for too little. Eleanor seized the chance. She leaned toward Keanu, her voice a stage whisper meant to carry. "First class is losing its standards, don't you think? They're letting anyone in here these days." She smirked, her eyes flicking to the man, then back to Keanu, daring him to agree. Keanu's hands stilled on his book. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not anger, but a quiet resolve that made the air feel heavier. He turned to her, his voice steady but firm. "He's not hurting anyone," he said. "Why does it matter what he's wearing?" Eleanor froze, her smirk fading. The man in the denim jacket paused, glancing back, his face tightening with a mix of embarrassment and defiance. She recovered quickly, tilting her head with a forced laugh. "Oh, come on, it's just an observation. Don't be so sensitive." But Keanu didn't let it slide. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking with hers. "It's not an observation when you say it like that," he said. "It's a judgment. And it's not just about me anymore. You're dragging him into it." His words were soft but sharp, cutting through her bravado like a blade through silk. Eleanor's heart thudded, a flicker of shame sparking deep inside her, but she smothered it with indignation. "Excuse me?" she snapped. "I don't need a lecture from someone who looks like he's one step above Coach." Her voice rose, drawing eyes from nearby seats. The man in the denim jacket turned fully now, his jaw clenched, hurt flashing in his eyes before he looked away. Keanu didn't flinch. "You don't know him," he said quietly. "You don't know me. But you're sure you're better than both of us. That's the problem." His words landed like stones, heavy with truth she didn't want to face. Eleanor's breath caught, her pride warring with a sudden unfamiliar pang of guilt. She'd wanted to push him out of her space, but now she'd pulled someone else into her crossfire, and Keanu wasn't letting her off the hook. The cabin felt smaller, the air thicker. She'd crossed a line, and for the first time she felt the weight of it. Not just in Keanu's steady stare, but in the quiet shift of attention around her. She wasn't in control anymore, and that terrified her more than she'd ever admit. The words hit like a thunderclap. Eleanor's mouth parted, but no sound came out. Her fortress crumbled, brick by brick, as the reality sank in. Co-owner, not some random upgrade, not some interloper. She'd been sparring with the man who held the keys to the kingdom she'd just threatened. Michael nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Mr. Reeves is a valued part of our team," he said, his tone firm but warm. "If there's an issue, I'm happy to assist, but he stays." Eleanor's face burned, a mix of shock and humiliation flooding her veins. She wanted to argue, to claw back control, but the ground had shifted beneath her. And then she heard it, a soft click, a rustle. Across the aisle, a young woman in her 20s lowered her phone, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and glee. Behind her, a businessman tilted his screen, fingers tapping furiously. The cabin wasn't just watching now, it was recording. Whispers rippled through the seats, and Eleanor felt the air change, heavy, with judgment and anticipation. "No," she breathed, her voice barely audible, but it was too late. The woman's phone screen glowed with a live feed, Eleanor's sharp profile, Keanu's calm resolve, the caption already forming, entitled "Woman Tries to Kick Man Off Flight, Doesn't Know He Owns the Plane." Views ticked up, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 in seconds. Eleanor's hands trembled as she gripped her purse, her world spiraling out of her grasp. She'd wanted power, attention, but not like this, not as the villain in a viral nightmare. Keanu leaned back, his expression unreadable, but there was a quiet steel in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "You didn't ask who I was," he said softly. "You just assumed." The words weren't cruel, but they cut deeper than any shout, stripping her bare. Eleanor stared at him, her throat tight, her mind racing for a way out, but there was none. The phones kept rolling, the whispers grew louder, and the truth she'd ignored crashed down around her. She'd picked a fight she couldn't win. Michael stepped back, his voice calm but final. "Let me know if you need anything, sir," he said to Keanu, then walked away. Eleanor sat frozen, the weight of 1,000 eyes, real and digital, pinning her in place. She'd wanted to prove her worth, but all she'd proven was how little she understood. And as the plane soared on, her empire of pride burned to ash in the palm of her hand. The plane soared on, but for Eleanor Grayson it felt like a free fall. Her empire of pride had burned to ash in the palm of her hand, and the cabin, once her sanctuary, now pulsed with a quiet, suffocating judgment. The viral video was a wildfire she couldn't outrun, its numbers climbing faster than she could process. 100,000 views, then 200,000, each tick a hammer against the life she'd built. Her phone buzzed relentlessly in her purse, a swarm of notifications she didn't dare face. She sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, the pearl suit she'd worn like armor now feeling like a shroud. She'd wanted to be seen, but not like this, not as a caricature of entitlement, a punchline for strangers to dissect. Across the aisle, the young woman's phone screen still glowed, the video looping silently now, Eleanor's sharp words and Keanu's calm rebuke playing on repeat. Comments flooded in. Who does she think she is? Keanu's a legend. She's done. Each one a splinter under her skin. She caught a glimpse of her own face, frozen mid-snarl, and flinched. That wasn't her. Not the Eleanor Grayson who'd chaired charity galas, who'd closed million-dollar deals with a smile, or was it? The thought clawed at her, but she shoved it down, her jaw tightening. She wouldn't crumble. Not here. Not yet. Keanu Reeves sat beside her, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm she'd unleashed. He'd reopened his book, but his attention shifted as the man in the denim jacket, the one she'd mocked, returned from the restroom. The man's shoulders were slumped, his eyes fixed on the floor, the weight of her words still clinging to him like damp clothes. Eleanor didn't look at him. She couldn't. But Keanu did. He set his book down and leaned toward the aisle, his voice low but clear. "Hey," he said, catching the man's eye. "You okay?" The man hesitated, then nodded, a faint, grateful smile breaking through his weariness. "Yeah, thanks. Just long day." Keanu nodded back, then reached into his hoodie pocket, pulling out a small card. "If you're ever in a bind, call this number. It's a friend who helps with travel stuff. Might come in handy." He handed it over, casual but sincere, like it was nothing. The man took it, his expression softening, a flicker of relief in his eyes. "Appreciated, man, really." Eleanor caught the exchange from the corner of her vision, and something twisted in her chest, sharp, unfamiliar, like a crack in a dam she'd spent years reinforcing. Keanu didn't glance her way, didn't flaunt his kindness. He just did it, then picked up his book again, as if the world hadn't shifted for someone else because of him. She wanted to scoff, to call it a performance, but the lump in her throat wouldn't let her. It was real, and that made her feel smaller than any viral video ever could. Her phone buzzed again, insistent, pulling her back to her own unraveling. She fished it out, hands trembling, and glanced at the screen. Texts from her assistant. "Eleanor, the board's freaking out, call me." From her sister, "Is this video you? What happened?" From a colleague, "Marston Foundation's pulling your invite, damage control, ASAP." Each message was a brick falling from the tower of her reputation, and she couldn't catch them fast enough. She turned the phone face down, her breath shallow, her mind racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was Eleanor Grayson. Untouchable, unstoppable. But now, she was trending for all the wrong reasons, her name a hashtag tied to words like arrogant and disgrace. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and distant. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into New York. Please prepare for landing." The words barely registered. Eleanor's world was already crashing, and the runway wouldn't save her. She stared out the window, the clouds blurring into a gray haze, and for the first time, she felt the sting of tears she refused to let fall. She'd wanted to prove her worth, but all she'd proven was how easily she could hurt, and how quickly the world could turn. Keanu's voice broke her spiral, soft but steady. "You okay?" he asked, not looking at her, his tone devoid of judgment. It wasn't pity, it was a lifeline, and that made it worse. She swallowed hard, forcing a brittle laugh. "Why wouldn't I be?" she snapped, but her voice cracked, betraying her. He didn't push, just nodded slightly, letting the question hang. And in that silence, she saw the man in the denim jacket tucking the card into his wallet, the faint hope in his posture. Then she saw herself, hours ago, sneering at him, at Keanu, at anyone who didn't fit her mold. Her phone buzzed again, her daughter this time. "Mom, call me. People are saying awful things. I'm worried." The words hit like a punch, and Eleanor's breath caught. Her daughter's voice echoed in her mind, young and trusting, the one person she'd never wanted to disappoint. She'd built her life to give her family everything, but what had she just given them? Shame? A mother they couldn't recognize? The crack in the dam widened, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting the flood. She didn't look at Keanu again. Couldn't. But his quiet act of kindness lingered, a mirror she hadn't asked for. She'd hurt people, not just with words, but with the arrogance she'd worn like a crown. And now the consequences were hers to bear. The plane dipped lower, the ground rushing up to meet them, and Eleanor realized something cold and clear. This wasn't the end of her fall. It was the beginning of facing who she'd become. The plane dipped lower, the ground rushing up to meet them, and Eleanor Grayson realized something cold and clear. This wasn't the end of her fall. It was the beginning of facing who she'd become. The wheels touched down with a jolt, the cabin shuddering as the aircraft slowed, but Eleanor's world kept spinning. Her phone was a live wire in her purse, buzzing with the weight of a life unraveling, her daughter's plea, her colleagues' panic, the public's scorn. She unbuckled her seatbelt with trembling hands, her breath shallow, her mind a tangle of dread and defiance. She'd lost control in the sky, and now, on the ground, she'd face the wreckage. The cabin door opened, and chaos poured in. Voices shouted her name. "Miss Grayson, over here!" Sharp and relentless, cutting through the hum of deboarding passengers. Camera flashes pierced the dim light of the jet bridge, and Eleanor stumbled as she stepped out, her heels unsteady on the metal grate. Reporters swarmed like hornets, microphones thrust toward her, questions overlapping in a deafening roar. "Do you regret what you said? What's your response to the video? Are you sorry?" She pulled her sunglasses down, a flimsy shield against the onslaught, and tried to push through, head low, heart pounding. Her name, once a badge of power, was now a curse echoing in her ears. She reached the terminal curb, the cold New York air biting at her skin, but there was no escape. The crowd pressed closer, a wall of judgment she couldn't breach. Her phone buzzed again. Her assistant, probably, or the board, ready to cut her loose. She clutched her purse, her knuckles white, and braced for the inevitable: disgrace, exile, the end of everything she'd built. She'd wanted to be untouchable, but now she was exposed. Raw, a woman stripped of her armor by her own hand. Then, a voice cut through the noise, low, steady, unmistakable. "Hey, back off a minute." It was Keanu Reeves. He stepped forward from behind her, his hoodie still slouched, his presence quiet but commanding. The reporters faltered, their frenzy pausing, as he raised a hand, not in anger but in calm authority. Cameras swung toward him, and Eleanor froze, her breath catching. She hadn't expected him to follow, let alone speak. He'd won. Why was he here? Keanu faced the crowd, his eyes steady, his voice clear. "She made a mistake," he said, each word deliberate. "We've all been there. Doesn't mean she's done." The reporters blinked, caught off guard, and a murmur rippled through them. Eleanor's head snapped up, her sunglasses slipping as she stared at him. Disbelief warring with a flicker of something softer, hope, maybe, or shame. He glanced at her, his gaze soft but unflinching, then turned back to the camera. "People deserve a chance to fix things. That's what matters, not tearing them down when they're already falling." The words hung in the air, simple but heavy, a lifeline tossed into the chaos. A reporter piped up, skeptical. "You're defending her after what she said?" Keanu nodded, unfazed. "I'm not defending what she did. I'm saying she's human. We all are." He stepped back, his piece said, and the crowd parted slightly, not out of fear, but respect. Eleanor stood rooted, her throat tight, tears she'd fought all flight threatening to spill. He didn't owe her this, not after her venom, her arrogance. But here he was, offering her a thread to hold on to. The reporters hesitated, then shifted focus, some chasing Keanu as he walked toward a waiting car, others lingering with Eleanor, their questions softer now, less vicious. "Will you apologize, Ms. Grayson?" one asked. She swallowed, her voice hoarse as she finally spoke. "Yes," she said, barely above a whisper. "I will." It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. a crack in the wall she'd built around herself. The cameras flashed again, but she didn't flinch this time. She watched Keanu climb into the car, his figure disappearing behind tinted glass, and felt the weight of his words settle into her bones. He drove away, leaving behind a terminal buzzing with whispers of his grace, his quiet strength. Passengers from the flight lingered, some nodding in approval, others filming still. But the tone had shifted, less a witch hunt, more a question mark. Eleanor stood alone on the curb, the cold seeping through her suit, her phone silent for the first time in hours. She pulled it out, her daughter's text glowing on the screen. "Mom, call me. I'm worried." Her fingers hovered, then typed. "I'm okay, I'm sorry, I'll fix this." She hit send, a promise to more than just her child. The crowd thinned, the reporters drifting off, and Eleanor took a shaky breath. She'd lost everything today, her pride, her power, her pedestal. But Keanu had given her something back, a chance, not to reclaim what she'd been, but to become something better. She thought of the man in the denim jacket, the card Keanu had slipped him, the kindness she'd mocked. Her chest ached, not with anger now, but with resolve. She'd apologize publicly, fully, and then she'd do more. She'd listen, learn, rebuild, not for the spotlight, but for the daughter waiting at home, for the strangers she'd hurt, for herself. Justice hadn't come with a gavel or a cage. It had come with a hand extended, a door left open. Keanu had walked away a victor, not by crushing her, but by lifting her up when she least deserved it. And as Eleanor stepped into a cab, the city humming around her, she knew the real work was just beginning. The world had seen her fall, but maybe, just maybe, it could see her rise. What do you think? Does everyone deserve a second chance even after a fall like Eleanor's? I believe Keanu's choice to step in shows us something powerful. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about giving someone room to grow. It's easy to cheer when arrogance gets humbled, but harder to root for redemption when the wounds are fresh. Maybe that's the real test. Not just holding people accountable, but believing they can change. I'd argue it's a risk worth taking, though I get it if you disagree. Some scars cut deep, and forgiveness can feel like a luxury. What's your take? Drop your thoughts below. I'm reading every one. Huge thanks for sticking with this story. If it moved you, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. More tales like this are coming your way. Let's keep the conversation going.